You've entered void of rules, a realm where normal constraints cease to exist. But beware, traveller, there is one rule here. You've got to hit subscribe. Seriously, it's the only rule we have. We just reached 1,000 brave souls, and we're hunting for 9,000 more to complete our dark ritual. I mean, reach our next goal, so subscribe. Or don't. But remember, the void remembers those who defy the only rule. Now let's get into today's video. The headlights of my Honda Civic pierced the Nevada darkness like twin needles threading through black velvet. It was just past 10 in the evening when I first laid eyes on the Clown Motel, and I swear the building looked back at me. The October desert had already turned vicious with cold, but that wasn't why I shivered as I pulled into the gravel parking lot. I'm Tobias Westbrook, though the people who know me call me Toby. 31 years old, former luxury resort supervisor, and apparently the only person desperate enough to take a night manager position at what locals called Satan's roadside attraction. The motel's neon sign didn't just flicker between red and yellow, it pulsed like a diseased heart, casting shadows that moved independently of any light source. The building itself defied every principle of welcoming hospitality I'd learned in my career. It squatted against the desert like a malignant tumour, its exterior walls covered in painted clown faces that seemed to shift position when I wasn't looking directly at them. The grins were too wide, the eyes too knowing, and every single one appeared to be watching my car as I parked. Next door stretched an old cemetery, its weathered headstones catching the motel's glow like broken fangs. But it was the smell that hit me first when I stepped out of my car. Not just the expected desert sage and dust, but something underneath. Something sweet and rotting, like flowers left too long on a grave. I'd taken this position because failure wasn't an option. My last job had ended in spectacular disaster when a guest died in our pool, and the subsequent investigation revealed safety violations I'd overlooked. Insurance companies had blacklisted me from major chains, leaving places like this as my only path back to respectability. The Clown Motel represented rock bottom, but I planned to polish it into something resembling success. Walking through the lobby doors felt like stepping into a fever dream designed by a serial killer with artistic pretensions. Every surface crawled with clown imagery, but these weren't the cheerful circus performers of childhood memory. Vintage circus posters featured deranged clowns with filed teeth and hollow eyes. Handmade dolls sat in carefully arranged tableaux, their human hair matted and greasy, their glass eyes following movement with predatory focus. Horror movie masks lined the walls like hunting trophies. Pennywise, Captain Spaulding, Art the Clown. But up close they looked less like movie props and more like death masks cast from actual faces. Above the front desk, a mechanical clown head hung from rusty chains, its painted smile cracked to reveal what looked disturbingly like real teeth underneath. The air itself felt thick and oppressive, carrying whispers just below the threshold of hearing. Every breath tasted of old makeup and something metallic that made my tongue feel numb. "You must be Westbrook." The voice emerged from behind the reception counter like smoke from a crematorium. A skeletal figure in his late 30s materialized from the back office, and I had to suppress a gasp at his appearance. Orion Blackthorne looked like he'd been slowly dying for months. Hollow cheeks, trembling hands, and eyes that darted constantly to shadows that shouldn't have been moving. 18 months, he muttered, more to the air than to me. 18 months of watching them feed, and I finally found someone stupid enough to take my place. His laugh was the sound of breaking glass. "You have absolutely no idea what you've stumbled into, do you, Westbrook?" As Orion led me through the standard procedures, check-in protocols, maintenance schedules, emergency contacts, I noticed details that made my skin crawl. Guest registration books showed occupancy rates that shouldn't have been possible. Rooms were listed as occupied by guests with names like Mr. Giggles, the Smiling Man, and Patches the Eternal. The cleaning supply closet was stocked with industrial-grade bleach, bone meal, and salt in quantities that suggested regular, heavy use. The building itself seemed to breathe around us. Floorboards creaked in patterns that sounded almost like Morse code, and I could swear I heard children's laughter echoing from the ventilation system. When I mentioned this to Orion, his face went ashen. "Rule 3, he whispered, glancing nervously at the ceiling vents. "You'll understand soon enough." As 11 o'clock approached, Orion's behaviour shifted from nervous to panicked. He kept checking his watch with the obsession of a man watching a countdown to his own execution. Finally, he disappeared into the back office and returned carrying what looked like a grimoire, bound in leather so dark it seemed to absorb light. "What I'm about to show you," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "isn't part of any corporate training manual. These pages contain 23 years of accumulated survival knowledge, written in the blood of every manager who came before you. Some of them learned these rules through observation. Others..." He opened the journal to reveal newspaper clippings, pasted between handwritten pages. Others provided the examples of what happens when you fail to follow them. The headlines made my stomach turn. "Motel manager found dismembered. Mysterious disappearance baffles police. Coroner unable to explain cause of death." Each article was accompanied by crime scene photos that looked less like accidents and more like artistic statements made with human flesh. "Every killer clown in this place is real," Orion continued, his hands shaking as he turned the pages. "They're not costumes, they're not animatronics, and they're definitely not human. They're something that crawled out of hell wearing grease paint and rubber noses, and they exist for one purpose: to turn human suffering into their own twisted form of entertainment." The rules were written in different hands, each entry added by a different manager who had discovered them through experience, both terrible and enlightening. Rule 1, never speak directly to the killer clown mannequin in room 11. It remembers every voice it hears and can mimic them perfectly to lure future victims. Previous manager Thomas Chen made the mistake of saying "good evening" during his first round. It spent the next 3 weeks calling other guests using his voice, begging them to let it out. Rule 2, at exactly 2:15 a.m, leave a bag of candy outside room 4 and retreat to the office immediately. Never witness the feeding. Manager Rebecca Santos ignored this rule and watched through the security camera. She was found the next morning with her eyes surgically removed and candy wrappers stuffed in the sockets. Rule 3. If you hear children's laughter from the boiler room, seal every vent in the building with duct tape for exactly 1 hour. The laughter belongs to something that mimics children, to draw adults into the basement. Manager David Kim followed the sound and was discovered 3 days later, aged to death in the boiler room, with his body positioned as if he'd been playing hide and seek. Rule 4. The mechanical clown head above the front desk must have its eyes covered with black cloth between midnight and dawn. Uncovered, it serves as a beacon that calls every killer clown in a 50-mile radius to hunt. The night manager, Jennifer Walsh, forgot this rule. 17 people died across 3 counties, all found with their faces painted in clown makeup. Rule 5. Never enter any room where the doorknob is smeared with red paint. The killer clown inside is molting, shedding its human disguise to reveal what it truly is. During this process, they're in constant agony and will take that pain out on anyone within reach. Manager Robert Hayes ignored this rule. They found pieces of him arranged in a smiley face pattern across the room's walls. Rule 6. If a clown doll's position changes, sprinkle salt in a circle around it and recite, "The show is over," 3 times. Never touch it directly. The dolls are vessels. When a killer clown dies, its consciousness can inhabit any nearby replica. Physical contact allows them to inhabit you instead. Rule 7. Keep crucifixes and garlic by every window. Killer clowns retain some memories from their human lives. including religious fears and phobias from whatever they were before transformation. These items won't stop them, but they'll hesitate long enough for you to escape. Rule 8. Between 3:30 a.m. and 4:30 a.m. is blood hour. All lights must be extinguished, and you must hide in the basement storage room until it passes. This is when they feed on any humans unlucky enough to be awake. The storage room is protected by wards carved into the foundation stones. Step outside during blood hour, and you become part of their entertainment. Each rule was annotated with specific details that made my blood run cold. Diagrams showing proper salt circle construction, timestamps for when each rule became critical, and worst of all, detailed descriptions of what happened to managers who failed to follow them exactly. "You think I'm insane," Orion said, noticing my expression. "That's what they all think, until they see one move for the first time, until they hear one speak in their dead mother's voice, until they realize that some things exist purely to transform human joy into human terror." He showed me his forearms, rolling up his sleeves to reveal deep scars that formed perfect handprints. "Room 11, he explained. "First week on the job. It called to me using my daughter's voice, begging Daddy to come save her from the bad clown. I almost opened that door." "This is impossible," I said, though my voice sounded hollow even to me. "You're talking about supernatural creatures like something from a movie." "Movies," Orion laughed bitterly. "You think Hollywood invented killer clowns? They've been documenting them, not creating them. Every horror film you've ever seen about evil clowns is based on something real. Something that actually happened to someone who didn't follow the rules." He moved toward the exit with the desperate urgency of a man fleeing a burning building. "The rules are all that stand between you and them. Follow every single one, no matter what you hear, no matter what you see, no matter who begs you to break them. The moment you deviate, even slightly, they're free to add you to their collection." "Wait," I called after him. "You can't just abandon me here with this insanity." But Orion was already pushing through the glass doors, his final words echoing in the lobby. "The eternal circus finally set me free. May God have mercy on your soul, because they sure as hell won't." I stood alone in the lobby, surrounded by hundreds of grinning faces that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. The building settled around me, with sounds that were too rhythmic to be random settling, more like breathing or perhaps laughter played at frequencies just below human hearing. Despite every rational instinct screaming that this was elaborate theatre, designed to maintain the motel's reputation, something primal in my brain recognized genuine danger. The air itself felt predatory, as if the building was actively hunting me. My first night began with aggressive denial. I treated each rule like corporate policy, something to follow for liability reasons while I figured out the real operation. But the mechanical clownhead's eyes seemed to track my movement with impossible accuracy, and I could swear the painted faces on the lobby dolls shifted position when I wasn't looking directly at them. At midnight, I climbed onto a chair and draped black cloth over the mechanical head's eyes as instructed. The moment the fabric made contact with those painted orbs, the oppressive atmosphere in the lobby changed dramatically. The whispers stopped. The feeling of being watched diminished. Even the air seemed to move more freely, as if something had stopped holding its breath. The first real test came at 2:15 a.m. I approached room 4 carrying a bag of assorted candy, feeling ridiculous but unwilling to risk whatever consequence might follow disobedience. The hallway was dimly lit by emergency lighting that cast long, dancing shadows. My footsteps echoed off worn carpet that squished slightly underfoot, as if it was saturated with something I didn't want to identify. I placed the bag outside the door, as instructed, and turned to leave immediately. But something made me pause at the corner, some morbid curiosity that demanded I witness what would happen to my offering. For several long minutes, nothing moved. The hallway remained silent except for the building's rhythmic creaking. Then I heard it. A wet, riping sound like raw meat being pulled apart by eager hands. Something pale and impossibly long slithered under the door gap, wrapped around the candy bag with fingers that had too many joints and dragged it back inside with predatory speed. The door itself never opened. Whatever was in room 4 had no need for human conveniences like doorknobs or hinges. I ran back to the office, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged animal. Whatever inhabited room 4 wasn't human, wasn't animatronic, and definitely wasn't part of any theme park experience. It was something that existed in the spaces between what was supposed to be possible and what actually was. During my security rounds, I discovered evidence that made denial impossible. Deep, claw marks gouged into walls at chest height, carved with such force that they'd penetrated through drywall into the wooden studs beneath. Dark stains covered sections of carpet in patterns that suggested something had been dragged, bleeding, from room to room. The stains reeked of copper and decay, despite obvious attempt at cleaning, as if whatever had bled here had left a permanent mark on reality itself. Several rooms were sealed with heavy chains and warning signs in multiple languages, including some scripts I didn't recognize. Room 13 bore the most extensive security. Not just chains, but also crucifixes, mirrors, and symbols that looked like they belonged in medieval grimoires rather than on motel doors. Guest logbooks from previous months painted a picture of systematic terror, complaints about breathing in the walls, children crying from empty rooms, and something watching from under the bed filled page after page. Multiple guests reported their belongings being rearranged into disturbing patterns while they slept, and several mentioned waking up to find clown dolls that hadn't been there when they went to bed. Most disturbing were the missing person reports. Families would check in together, but only some members would check out. When questioned, the remaining family members would claim they'd always been travelling alone, with no memory of the missing people ever existing. By sunrise of my first night, my worldview had fundamentally shifted. The building pulsed with malevolent intelligence that made my skin crawl constantly. Every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes, and the constant creaking of the structure had developed an almost conversational rhythm, as if the building itself was trying to communicate. The following nights became a descent into supernatural horror that challenged everything I thought I knew about reality. Each evening brought new evidence that the killer clowns weren't just real. They were intelligent, organized, and utterly hostile, well, to human life. On my fifth night, I discovered that one of the lobby clown dolls had moved. A 3-foot-tall figure in a Victorian-era circus costume had been sitting on the reception desk when I started my shift. During my 2 a.m. security round, I found it positioned in my office chair, its painted smile somehow seeming wider than anatomically possible. Following Rule 6, I retrieved salt from the supply closet and carefully poured it in a circle around the doll. The salt itself seemed to smoke when it made contact with the floor, forming a barrier that shimmered with otherworldly energy. "The show is over," I recited 3 times, my voice shaking with each repetition. "The show is over. The show is over." For a terrifying moment, the doll's painted features began to shift and flow like wet clay. Its benign smile twisted into a snarling mouth filled with needle-sharp teeth, and its glass eyes rolled back to reveal something writhing underneath. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the transformation reversed, leaving the doll frozen in its original harmless expression. I left it exactly where it was, salt circle intact, and made a mental note to never, under any circumstances, touch any of the dolls directly. Night 8 brought a new variety of terror. During my evening rounds, I found room 14's doorknobs smeared with fresh red paint that was still wet to the touch. Through the thin door, I could hear something large moving around inside, furniture being overturned, walls being scratched, and what sounded like someone skinning a large animal. Then came the voice that nearly broke my resolve. "Please help me," it sobbed in the perfect pitch and cadence of a terrified child. "I'm hurt and I can't find my mummy. Please open the door. I'm so scared." The voice was flawless, not just the words, but the emotion behind them. I could hear genuine terror, innocent confusion, and desperate need for comfort. Every parental instinct in my body screamed at me to help this child, to throw open the door and offer protection. But I remembered Orion's scars and the newspaper clippings of dismembered managers. Whatever was inside room 14 had learned to perfectly mimic human emotion as a hunting strategy. It wasn't a child in distress. It was something that had studied children in distress and learned to recreate their sounds for the purpose of luring adults within reach. I backed away slowly, fighting every humanitarian impulse I possessed, and marked room 14 as occupied by something that would never check out. The worst nights were when blood hour arrived. At exactly 3:30 a.m, I would extinguish every light in the building and make my way to the basement storage room, guided only by the glow-in-the-dark paint Orion had applied to the stair railings. The storage room itself was small and cramped, filled with old motel supplies and boxes of promotional materials from decades past. But carved into the foundation stones were symbols that predated the motel by centuries, protection wards that had been placed there by someone who understood exactly what kind of evil this land contained. Inside that circle of ancient power, I was safe from whatever prowled the floors above. From my hiding place, I could hear them moving around upstairs, footsteps that were too heavy and too numerous to belong to any guests we actually had registered. The sounds weren't random, they moved with purpose, checking rooms systematically, hunting for anyone unlucky enough to be awake during their feeding time. Sometimes I could hear them testing doors, rattling handles and scratching at wood, with claws that left gouges visible the next morning. Other times, I heard voices, perfect imitations of crying children, lost elderly people, or injured guests calling for help. The voices were always desperate, always innocent, and always trying to lure someone out of safety. Once, during my second week, something tried the storage room door itself. The handle turned slowly, testing whether it was locked, followed by gentle scratching that gradually became frantic clawing, but whatever power protected that room held firm, and eventually the presence moved on to hunt easier prey. 3 weeks into my employment, I had lost nearly 40 pounds and developed a permanent tremor in my hands. My brother Felix called regularly, becoming increasingly alarmed by my deteriorating mental state and paranoid rambling. "Toby, you're scaring me," he said during one of our conversations. "You sound like you haven't slept in weeks, and you keep talking about things that don't make sense. Maybe you should quit this job and get some help." But I couldn't quit. Not yet. I had witnessed something beyond human understanding, and walking away felt like abandoning some cosmic responsibility I didn't fully comprehend. These creatures were contained by rules that had been written in human blood over decades of deadly trial and error. If I left, who would maintain that containment? My research into the motel's history revealed a truth more horrifying than I could have imagined. The building wasn't just constructed over a mass grave, it was built as a prison. In 1959, a travelling circus train had derailed just outside Tonopah, but it wasn't an accident. The circus had been transporting something that should never have been allowed to travel, something that had been contained in carnival attractions for over a century. 47 performers died in the resulting fire, but they weren't ordinary people. They were individuals who had already been transformed by exposure to something ancient and malevolent, something that fed on human joy and transformed it into terror. The train crash had been a desperate attempt to stop their spread, but it had only freed them to haunt the crash site permanently. The motel had been built not despite the deaths, but because of them. It served as a modern prison, using hospitality industry protocols to maintain containment procedures that kept these creatures from spreading beyond Tonopah. Every manager was essentially a warden, and every rule was a bar on a cage built from human sacrifice and occult knowledge. Local newspaper archives revealed a pattern spanning decades. Whenever a manager abandoned their post or failed to follow the rules properly, disappearances would spike across a 50-mile radius. Missing hikers, vanished travelers, entire families who simply drove into the desert and were never seen again. The killer clowns weren't content to stay at the motel. They were constantly testing the boundaries of their prison, looking for ways to escape and spread their particular brand of horror across the world. Previous managers hadn't quit their jobs. They'd been recruited into a secret society of people who understood the cosmic importance of their work. Some had lasted years before the psychological toll became unbearable. Others had been consumed by the very creatures they were meant to contain. But all of them had contributed to the accumulated knowledge that kept something unspeakably evil locked away from the rest of humanity. On my 21st night, I faced the test that would determine whether I joined their ranks or became another cautionary tale written in the rulebook. A busload of college students had arrived that afternoon as part of a horror tourism road trip. They were young, excited, and completely dismissive of my increasingly frantic warnings about the genuine dangers they faced. "This place is incredible," one student said, posing for selfies with particularly grotesque lobby decorations. "The atmosphere is so authentic. You really commit to the scary manager role." I tried to explain that this wasn't a performance, that the danger was real and immediate, but they treated me like an actor playing a character, part of the immersive horror experience they had paid to enjoy. Their laughter at my obvious distress felt like mockery of every previous manager who had died trying to protect people exactly like them. As blood hour approached, I made my usual announcements over the intercom system. All guests must remain in their rooms between 3:30 and 4:30 a.m. This is not part of any entertainment program. This is for your actual physical safety. Do not leave your rooms for any reason during this time. Your lives depend on it. But their responses made it clear they thought this was all part of the show. I heard them in the hallways, laughing and planning to sneak around during the scary hour to see what special effects the motel had prepared. At 3:30 a.m. sharp, I extinguished every light in the building and made my way to the basement storage room. But this time, I'd prepared differently. I'd installed a small security monitor in the storage room, powered by a portable battery, so I could watch what happened during blood hour. If these students were going to die because of their ignorance, I wanted to document it. Maybe their deaths could serve as evidence, proof that would make future guests take the warning seriously. The screen flickered to life, showing green-tinted night vision footage of the motel's hallways. For the first few minutes, everything appeared normal. Then the hunting began. They didn't emerge from rooms or doorways. They materialized from the walls themselves, stepping out of solid matter as if it were water. The first one I saw clearly stood nearly 10 feet tall, its body a patchwork of rotting circus costume and exposed bone. One arm ended in a hand with claws like rusted railroad spikes, while the other had been replaced entirely with a collection of antique surgical instruments fused directly to the bone. Its face was the most horrifying thing I had ever seen. Half was painted in traditional clown white that had yellowed with age and cracked to reveal maggot-infested flesh underneath. The other half was exposed skull, but a skull that had been modified. Extra eye sockets drilled into the bone, each one housing a different coloured glass eye that moved independently of the others. "Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls," it announced in a voice like grinding broken glass, "welcome to the greatest show on earth. Tonight's performance will be interactive." More of them appeared throughout the building, a dozen distinct nightmares, each one a unique fusion of circus performer and torture device. They moved with the jerky, unnatural gait of broken marionettes, but there was nothing random about their coordination. This was organised, intelligent, and designed for maximum psychological impact before the physical horror began. The college students' laughter died quickly as they realised this wasn't special effects. Their screams started 10 minutes into blood hour and continued for the next 45 minutes as the killer clown systematically hunted them through the building. I watched in helpless horror as young people were cornered, toyed with, and finally consumed by creatures that existed solely to transform human joy into human terror. The killer clowns didn't just kill, they performed elaborate torture routines, each death a carefully choreographed piece of performance art designed to extract maximum suffering from their victims. "Please!" one young woman screamed as she ran down the hallway, chased by something that looked like a circus strongman crossed with a medieval torture device. "Somebody help us! This is real! They're actually real!" I gripped the edges of my chair, watching helplessly as she was cornered. Rule 8 was absolute. I could not leave the storage room during blood hour, no matter what I heard or saw. The rules had kept me alive for 3 weeks, but they also made me complicit in every death that occurred. The woman's screams cut off abruptly as something with too many teeth and not enough humanity caught up to her. For the next hour, I was forced to witness the systematic destruction of 8 innocent people who had come to my motel seeking entertainment and found something far more permanent. The killer clowns moved through the building like a well-rehearsed theatre troupe, each death a carefully planned scene in their ongoing performance. But it was what happened after the killing stopped that broke something inside me. At 4:15 a.m., with 15 minutes left in blood hour, the killer clowns gathered in the lobby for what looked like a cast meeting. They discussed the evening's performance with the casual professionalism of actors reviewing their work, critiquing each other's technique and planning improvements for future shows. "The screaming in room 7 could have been more sustained," the tall one commented, cleaning blood from its surgical instrument arm. "Perhaps we should consider breaking fewer bones initially to maintain vocal capacity." "Agreed," replied another that looked like a circus acrobat with too many joints in its limbs, and the chase sequence in the East Wing felt rushed. Terror is an art form that requires proper pacing. They were treating the murders as performance art, each death a contribution to their ongoing masterpiece of human suffering. These weren't mindless monsters. They were intelligent, creative, and utterly dedicated to perfecting their craft. As 4:30 a.m. approached and blood hour neared its end, they began to fade back into the walls, but not before one of them looked directly at the security camera I had hidden. "Excellent work tonight, Mr. Westbrook," it said, its multiple eyes focusing on the lens with impossible precision. "Your dedication to the rules has made tonight's performance possible. We look forward to many more collaborations." It knew. Somehow it knew I was watching, and it was thanking me for my complicity. The storage room door unlocked automatically as blood hour ended, but I remained frozen in my chair. The weight of what I had witnessed, what I had enabled through my obedience to the rules, crushed down on me like a physical force. These people had died because I followed protocols that prioritized my survival over theirs. They had died because I chose to hide in a basement while monsters hunted them. They had died because I was more afraid of breaking rules than I was committed to protecting innocent lives. But worse than the guilt was the realization that this was the system working exactly as designed. The killer clowns needed fresh victims to maintain their existence, and the motel provided a steady stream of people naive enough to ignore the warnings. I wasn't a protector. I was a curator maintaining a preserve where ancient evils could hunt humans for sport. The next morning, police found no trace of the college students except for their abandoned bus in the parking lot. Their belongings had been arranged in the lobby as new decorations, backpacks positioned like audience seating, cell phones displaying family photos arranged in a heart shape, and clothing draped over existing clown dolls like costume changes. When investigators questioned me, I told them the students had checked out early. claiming they were disappointed by the lack of supernatural activity. My story was backed up by doctored registration records that showed they had paid for only one night. The motel's systems were designed to erase evidence of anyone who died during blood hour, maintaining the illusion that nothing supernatural ever actually happened. For the next 2 nights, I went through the motions of following the rules while wrestling with the moral implications of my position. Every protocol I followed enabled future murders. Every rule I obeyed made me an accessory to systematic slaughter. But breaking the rules would only add my death to the count without saving anyone else. On my 24th night, fate forced my hand in the cruelest possible way. A family had checked in that afternoon. Parents with 2 young children who reminded me painfully of my own nephews. Despite my increasingly desperate warnings, they insisted on staying, believing the danger was part of an elaborate haunted house experience. As blood hour approached, I made my announcement with more urgency than ever before. This is not entertainment. These are not actors. If you leave your rooms between 3:30 and 4:30 a.m., you will die. Please, I'm begging you to take this seriously. But I could hear them laughing in their room, planning to explore the haunted motel during the scary hour. At 3:30 a.m., I extinguished the lights and made my way toward the basement. But halfway down the stairs, I heard the family's door open and excited whispers as they crept into the hallway. They thought they were about to experience the thrill of their lives. I could continue to the storage room and follow Rule 8, watching through my security monitor as these children were tortured to death by creatures that existed to cause suffering. Or I could break the rule that had kept me alive for nearly a month and try to save them. The choice should have been simple. But as I stood on those basement stairs, I realized that saving them would require more than just breaking Rule 8. It would require abandoning my post entirely, leaving the motel without a manager to maintain the containment protocols. Without someone to follow the rules, the killer clowns would be free to escape their prison and hunt across the entire region. My conscience warred with cosmic responsibility: save 4 people and damn hundreds, or sacrifice 4 to protect countless others. In the end, it wasn't a choice at all. I heard the little girl's voice echoing in the hallway, not mimicked by a killer clown, but genuine and innocent, and utterly terrified as she realized the danger was real. I grabbed a crucifix and several cloves of garlic from my emergency supplies, weapons that Rule 7 claimed would provide some protection. My hands shook as I climbed back up the basement stairs, but my heart felt lighter than it had in weeks. Whatever happened next, I would face it knowing I had chosen compassion over compliance. The moment I stepped into the main floor hallway, every light in the building began strobing red. The killer clowns hadn't just been waiting for blood hour, they had been waiting for me to break Rule 8, to give them the excuse they needed to hunt freely. The crucifix in my hand began to smoke and crumble before I had taken 3 steps. The garlic cloves turned black and dissolved like ash between my fingers. Whatever protective power these items once possessed was nothing compared to the cosmic authority of the rules I had just violated. I ran towards the family's screams, desperate to reach them before it was too late. But with each step, the hallway seemed to stretch longer, the distance expanding into impossible geometry that defied the building's actual dimensions. The killer clowns weren't just hunting the family anymore. They were hunting me, and they were savoring every moment of the chase. Behind me, I heard the basement door slam shut with a sound like a coffin closing. Ahead of me, shapes began emerging from the walls themselves, not walking through doorways, but literally stepping out of solid matter, as if the building's structure was merely a suggestion they chose to ignore when convenient. The first one I encountered up close was the tall one, with surgical instruments for an arm. But seeing it in person, outside the safety of my security monitor, I realized how inadequate my previous observations had been. It wasn't just wearing a costume. Its flesh had been surgically modified, stitched and grafted, with circus decorations until it was impossible to tell where the performer ended and the performance began. "Mr. Westbrook," it said in that voice like grinding glass, its multiple eyes focusing on me with predatory delight. "How wonderful that you finally decided to join our show. We've been preparing a very special performance just for you." More of them appeared from every direction, surrounding me in the hallway with choreographed precision. Each one was a unique nightmare. An acrobat whose joints bent in directions that would be fatal to human anatomy. A strongman whose muscles had been replaced with mechanical pistons. A juggler whose hands had been amputated and replaced with spinning blades. "The children," I gasped, still hoping I could reach them in time. "Oh, they're perfectly safe," the juggler replied, its blade hands spinning with metallic musical notes. "Safe in our care, being prepared for tonight's grand finale. You see, we've decided to make this performance truly special. A family show with you as the guest of honor." They herded me towards the lobby like wolves driving prey, their movements coordinated and purposeful. I tried to run, but my legs felt like they were moving through thick mud. The building itself had turned against me, becoming a trap designed to deliver me into their clutches. In the lobby, I found the family bound and gagged, but still alive, positioned like audience members in front of a makeshift stage. The children were crying, but they were breathing. There was still time to save them if I could find a way to break free. "Ladies and gentlemen," the tall killer clown announced to the empty lobby, "tonight we present a very special performance. A morality play about the consequences of heroism in a world that rewards only survival." They had prepared props, instruments of torture that looked like they belonged in a medieval dungeon, crossed with a modern operating theatre. This wasn't going to be a quick death. They planned to make my suffering into entertainment, a final performance that would serve as both punishment for breaking the rules and warning to future managers. The rules weren't arbitrary guidelines, the acrobat explained, as it arranged surgical tools on a nearby table. They were a binding contract, forged in blood and maintained by sacrifice. By following them, you helped us contain our hunger to this small space, allowing us to feed occasionally while preventing us from spreading our gifts across the world. But now, the strong man added, its piston muscles hissing with steam, "You've broken the contract. The containment field is dissolving. Soon we'll be free to bring our special brand of entertainment to every corner of this beautiful world." I realized with growing horror that my attempt to save 4 lives had doomed countless others. The killer clowns weren't just contained to the motel by the rules. They were powered down, forced into a kind of supernatural hibernation that limited their abilities. By breaking Rule 8, I'd given them access to their full potential for the first time in decades. "Why?" I gasped, struggling against invisible bonds that held me in place. "Why tell me this? Why not just kill me?" The tall one's multiple eyes all focused on me, simultaneously, creating a kaleidoscope of malevolent attention. "Because, dear manager, death would be too simple. Too final. We prefer our art to have lasting impact." It gestured to a corner of the lobby I hadn't noticed before, where dozens of photographs were displayed like a gallery wall. Each image showed a different person, men and women of various ages, all wearing the same expression of absolute terror. Below each photo was a small brass nameplate with dates spanning back to 1962. "Every manager who came before you," the acrobat explained. "Each one thought they could save someone. Each one broke the rules for noble reasons, and each one joined our permanent collection, their consciousness preserved, in our special gallery of human emotion." The photographs weren't just pictures, they were windows. I could see the eyes in each image moving, tracking my movement with desperate awareness. These people weren't dead. They were trapped, conscious and suffering for over 60 years. "You see," the juggler continued, its blade hands creating a hypnotic rhythm. Killing you would waste such beautiful terror, but preserving you, keeping you aware and helpless, while we use your failures as motivation to recruit new managers. That's art. They began their work with surgical precision, each cut and burn carefully calculated to maximize pain while maintaining consciousness. The family was forced to watch their children's innocence being systematically destroyed by witnessing horrors no human mind should endure. But as the torture continued, something unexpected happened. The pain, instead of breaking me, began to clarify my thinking. Through the agony, I started to understand the true nature of what was happening here. The killer clowns weren't supernatural entities at all. They were something far worse. They were human beings who had voluntarily transformed themselves into monsters through decades of systematic evil. The circus train crash hadn't created them. It had simply freed them from the constraints of pretending to be normal performers. Each one had chosen this existence, embracing corruption so completely that they had physically transformed into manifestations of their own depravity. They fed not on human flesh or blood, but on human suffering, each scream and tear strengthening their ability to cause more pain. The rules hadn't been written to contain supernatural forces. They had been developed to enable a protection racket run by the most sophisticated serial killers in human history. By following the protocols, managers weren't preventing evil, they were managing it, ensuring a steady supply of victims while maintaining plausible deniability for the authorities. And now, by breaking free of their self-imposed limitations, they were planning to expand their operation far beyond a single roadside motel. As this realization dawned on me, I noticed something else. The photographs on the wall weren't just portraits of victims, they were power sources. Each trapped consciousness was being used to fuel the killer clown's abilities, their perpetual suffering converted into supernatural energy. If I could find a way to disrupt that connection to free even one of the trapped managers, it might create a cascade failure that would weaken their entire system. Using the last of my strength, I began reciting the one rule Orion had never written down, the one rule that had been passed from manager to manager through whispered conversations, rather than written instructions. If all else fails, if the rules are broken and hope is lost, speak the name of the first manager aloud 3 times. His sacrifice will protect you. Harold Morrison, I gasped through blood-filled lungs. Harold Morrison, Harold Morrison. The effect was immediate and devastating. Every photograph on the wall began to glow with brilliant white light, and the trapped consciousnesses of 60 years' worth of managers suddenly broke free of their prison. Their combined psychic scream shattered every window in the building and sent the killer clowns reeling backward in pain, but their freedom came at a price. As each consciousness escaped its photographic prison, it took with it a piece of the killer clown's stolen power. The creatures began to age rapidly, their surgically modified bodies breaking down as decades of borrowed time caught up to them all at once. "Impossible," the tall one screamed, its multiple eyes beginning to dim and crack. "We are eternal. We are perfection." "You're parasites," I replied, feeling strength returning to my limbs as the invisible bonds dissolved. And every parasite eventually kills its host. The killer clowns collapsed one by one, their bodies crumbling to dust as the power that sustained them for over a century finally dissipated. The family's bonds disappeared with their captors, and we all stumbled towards the exit as the building began to shake itself apart. But our escape was temporary. As we reached the parking lot, I realized that while the immediate threat was gone, the knowledge of what had happened here could never be allowed to spread. The authorities would never believe the truth, and any investigation would only lead to more victims, as curious people flocked to the site. I made the hardest decision of my life. Taking the family's car keys, I drove them to the nearest town and called in an anonymous tip about a gas leak at the Clown Motel. By the time emergency responders arrived, the building was already consumed by flames that burned with unnatural colours and left behind only ash that seemed to writhe and move on its own. The family recovered from their trauma with the help of therapists who specialised in processing supernatural encounters. I made sure they were financially compensated through an insurance settlement that listed the incident as a severe psychological trauma resulting from elaborate haunted house effects. As for me, I spent the next 6 months in a psychiatric facility, officially being treated for a breakdown caused by isolation and stress. Unofficially, I was being debriefed by a government agency that specialised in containing information about supernatural incidents. They offered me a job working with similar cases across the country, places where ancient evils had taken root and required ongoing management. I accepted, understanding that my experience at the Clown Motel had qualified me for a career I never could have imagined. The Clown Motel site was eventually cleaned up and converted into a memorial garden for victims of highway accidents. No memorial mentioned the real victims, the hundreds of people who had been consumed by creatures that existed solely to cause suffering. But sometimes, on particularly dark nights, travellers along Highway 95 report seeing the ghostly outline of a neon sign flickering in the desert. And occasionally someone will hear the distant sound of calliope music carried on the wind, followed by laughter that sounds too mechanical to be human. The show, it seems, must always go on. I keep in touch with Harold Morrison, the first manager, whose spirit still wanders the desert, where the motel once stood. He tells me that evil like the killer clowns can never be truly destroyed, only contained, managed, and occasionally defeated by people willing to sacrifice everything to protect others. Every few months, I get reports of similar incidents at roadside attractions across the country, hotels with strange rules, amusement parks with rides that shouldn't exist, restaurants where the staff never seem to age. Each one requires investigation and occasionally intervention. It's not the hospitality career I planned, but it's the one I earned. And every night as I check into another motel, with its own set of inexplicable rules, I remember the most important lesson I learned in Tonopah. Sometimes the price of following rules is complicity in evil, but sometimes the price of breaking them is allowing evil to spread unchecked. The challenge is knowing the difference and being willing to pay whichever price protects the most innocent lives. The hardest truth I've learned is that heroes don't always win. Sometimes they just lose more slowly than everyone else, buying time for others to find better solutions. And sometimes that's enough. In my briefcase, I keep a new leather journal, black like the one Orion carried, but with blank pages waiting to be filled. Someday, I'll pass it to someone else who thinks they understand the cost of managing monsters. And I'll hope they're stronger than I was, smarter than I was, and lucky enough to find a way to break the cycle I couldn't escape. Because somewhere out there in the spaces between what's supposed to be possible and what actually is, the eternal circus is always looking for new performers. And the show, as they say, must go on. The only question is whether you'll be part of the audience or part of the act.